Hello, everyone. I'm Gabby Wood. I'm literary director of the Booker Prize Foundation, but I'm really here as a fan of Ian McEwan's, who I'm delighted to introduce you to. As you'll all know, no doubt, he's the author of almost 20 books now. You're getting there, yeah? Short story collections, novels, novellas, and I feel compelled to tell you that 6 of them have been listed for the Booker Prize, just because I should, but that's not his only achievement. Amsterdam won it, of course, in 1998, and you'll be familiar also with some of the films made from some of them. But today, we were due to talk, the title of this talk is The Machinations of Ian McEwan. I think not because we're going to hear about your dastardly thoughts, although we might, but because this book, Machines Like Me, was until very recently his latest. And then another one swerved into view this past Monday, The Cockroach, which is a novella, a satire based on certain recent political events, which you may or may not recognise. So we're going to talk about both. I actually wanted to ask you some joined-up question about both of them. Which, just relatively speaking, which was more fun to write?
This one came out of despair, or rather where despair and laughter might meet. This one I'd been sitting on for most of my life, so this one was much more absorbing in a sense. Yeah, I mean, it's a much more considered project.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Well, we'll come around to The Cockroach afterwards. But let's talk about Machines Like Me, because there's. Well, perhaps explain the ways in which you've been sitting on it for most of your life. Because
in 1978, I wrote a film for BBC, a drama starring Harriet Walter, directed by Richard Eyre, and principally it was about the role of women in the Second World War. And I read a memoir of a colonel who said. And he printed one speech, and he said, "Let no man do a job that could be done by a woman." So the typists and sweeper-uppers and drivers all became women. And I thought, what a strange and terrible thing to be saying. So it was about how Harriet Walter, her character, ends up at Bletchley. And there are long conversations based on my reading of Alan Turing's papers in the mid-30s about whether a machine could think. And out of that, I became interested in Alan Turing's, whose work at Bletchley had only just been declassified. It was it came into the record in the public domain in 1974. And I was researching this 2 or 3 years later. But ever since then, I've kept this interest in artificial intelligence. It was an endless disappointment. All the promises that Turing, in the late 40s, said, in 10 years' time, we'll have a thinking machine. What they didn't realize is how complex the brain is, not just the human brain, but mammal brain, even the brain of a fruit fly. And neuroscience has been a long, slow discovery of just how complex it is to catch a ball, for example, or to raise a cup to your lips, spatial awareness, being able to sort of automatically do the calculus and work out the parabola of a ball and put your hand there in space. Only 4 or 5 years ago, a huge robot was developed that can catch a ball. And that's all it can do. And that took a very long time. So AI has really had its fits and starts, but nothing really happened with it, except now in the last 10 years, the software has improved, the hardware somewhat improved, and of course, with the story of the deep mind beating first a Go master, and then more recently being able to play chess only knowing the rules, not number crunching like the computer that defeated Kasparov, which just worked out all the possible moves and then selected the best ones. Just knowing the rules and a computer, Demis Hassabis and his group devised a program that told the computer only the rules, then asked it to play itself, and then it started to play a very inhuman form of chess. So
Meaning what? What was inhuman? Sorry.
Sacrificing a bishop so early in the game, and you think, what's the point of that? And then 30 moves on, you go, ah. In other words, it was not bound by centuries of chess playing and gambits that are in all the textbooks. And also, as we've all noticed, AI is beginning to penetrate our lives. So that really became the starting point. Talking to Siri and Alexa and self-driving cars, autonomous vehicles will soon be on our roads. Philosophers are sitting down with car manufacturers to discuss whether the car should preserve the driver at the expense of a pedestrian, say. Big moral issues like this. And it struck me that even if machines are better at deciding that, whether you should swerve and kill yourself towards an incoming lorry, or swerve to hit a pedestrian, all in half a second, even if a machine can think through those possibilities more quickly than we can, it certainly can, maybe at 10,000 times the speed, it is a civilizational turning point that we should pass an ethical decision from ourselves to a machine. It's a line to cross. Whether you think it's good or bad, it is a line that we are sort of helplessly crossing.
Helplessly meaning?
Meaning we can't stop ourselves. There's been lots of good lots of non-fiction published lately, full of warning about what we're doing. But if it doesn't happen in one country, it's happening in another. And there's a race between the large economies of the world to develop AI in logistics and planning of electricity distribution, huge, big things. And we are now at the sort of turning point, really. And so I wanted to investigate, in a way that I think novels are rather good at, what it would be like to be in a close-up relationship with an entirely plausible artificial human. We are nowhere near such a creature, I accept, but I think to play this out, and I know I'm not alone in this, we've had Westworld and Humans and Blade Runner and much else, so I'm joining a conversation.
Yeah, your version of that conversation, your version of a part in that conversation shares quite a lot with other ideas that you've explored, or ideas that you've explored in other works, right? So these ethical decisions, I suppose that's broadly moral philosophy, isn't it? Or
the trolley problem's been around a long time, so Philippa Foot, a well-known Oxford philosopher, contemporary of Iris Murdoch, in fact. They were quite a group. There was one other philosopher. The men were off at war, and suddenly the women started philosophizing. It wasn't back to what that colonel said about, no man must do. I don't think any man could be doing what Iris Murdoch and
they're jobs that only women can do.
Yes, it's a long conversation that's been going on, and the dream of making an artificial human has its roots in classical antiquity. Prometheus, Jason and the Argonauts. And I would throw in there also the book of Genesis, first chapter. Here you have a super intelligence, and it makes some intelligent beings in its own likeness. You look skeptical.
No. Go on.
Well, it's part of that long dream, and then I think the modern text is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Right, yeah.
That's our first warning that, I think part of its brilliance is Frankenstein makes his robot, we won't call it a monster, but the robot turns into a murderer, but Mary Shelley makes this monster rather sympathetic. And also lonely. And I think that has shaped rather the discussion, the warning and the loneliness of an artificial human.
Yeah. No, I didn't mean to look skeptical. I suppose I was thinking two things. One is that I was partly referring to your own work, ethical problems, questions of love, loyalty, ethics. These are things that you're exploring, I suppose, all the time, in one form or another, either through medicine or law or, different stories are exploring quite similar things. But also, I suppose, it might be possible to disentangle things that are disembodiments, so Siri and AI of one sort, and humanoid versions of AI, which is what Frankenstein's robot is, and not Genesis, but partly because that's what you're introducing here. And one of the very first moments when, well, I suppose we should say a bit about what happens,
by the way,
the setup.
Don't worry about giving the plot away, it's fine.
Okay.
I don't mind.
Straight to the ending.
Memories are short.
Please make your memories very short and buy the book afterwards. The humanoid who comes into this and comes between two people who are not yet a couple at the beginning. I mean, it's entirely, this whole setup is entirely dependent on the strange plausibility of his humanoid form. And so, the man who owns, buys, introduces him into his home, family, I mean, all of these things come up. It's surprised by how quickly he's ascribing feelings to him, and it's almost instant in your book. And then, of course, the question, I mean, there's a turning point where there's a question of whether it's infidelity if the woman has sex with the machine. Is it just a machine? The machine announces he's in love. The machine writes poetry, reads, quotes Schopenhauer, I notice, on matters that might, be relevant, but free will, etc. I mean, that's not Siri, or perhaps it is, but the humanoid form was something specific. It does not bring,
This is a completely impossible fiction. It's set in 1982. Okay.
But that's because Turing hasn't died. We haven't mentioned this bit, but yeah, go on.
So Turing is a character in the novel. He has the life that was snatched away from him by his own hand, having been arrested and charged under the ancient, crude, and ridiculous laws against homosexuality in 1952, and he killed himself in 54. So I've given him the life that he might have had. He's become a sort of presiding figure of the digital age, but he's also usefully a sort of conscience in the novel itself. Well, I take as my one starting point is that even if we are nowhere near anything like Adam, we are highly predisposed to animate the world. So I've often said this, but anyone whose car is broken down and they get out and give it a hearty kick is already in an emotional relationship with the machine. Adam, on the other hand, offers much more than a broken down car. But I wanted to take the reader on the journey of what it would be like to be fully certain that the thing you've bought, you've paid for it, you own it. And at first you just think it's a whole set of brilliant algorithms, that the conversation, that you're really just playing an elaborate computer game, a sort of socially based computer game. But when that robot then has a one-night fling with the woman you love, if you think it's a machine, why do you feel jealous? And why are you in a rage? And why are you having a row? And I think that's the beginning of my narrator, Charlie, crossing the line in this process.
But that's because she might have feelings. It's partly to do with her urge, right? Not to do with what the machine's done.
She says, well, if I was upstairs with a vibrator, would we be having this argument? And that is the line that he's already crossed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, although the machine also knows things. It's possible for the machine to know things. Information comes between them. So disclosure, I suppose.
Adam has instant access to the internet, so he sort of knows a lot. He's also much more literate than his owner. So he's read everything.
He's less lazy as well.
Yeah. And he knows his Shakespeare, he's read Herbert, whereas the narrator, who's sort of intelligent enough, hasn't read Hamlet. He's not a literary guy. And it's important for me to have a scene where he meets his prospective father-in-law and who's been warned that they're bringing a robot. thinks that Charlie is the robot.
That's really good.
Because the prospective father-in-law is a very literary man, something of a failed figure, and rather cross, a crotchety old sort of fellow. And when he asks Charlie what he's been reading lately, old Charlie says, well, he read some electronics magazines, whereas when he talks to Adam, they have a lively discussion about Herbert. So at that point, the narrator begins to realize that the father-in-law thinks that he's just a horrible visitation from the future.
And actually, which touches on these questions. I mean, I suppose years ago when I did a bit of looking into this, one of the things that interested me most was how anxious people got around imitations of human life. So, why does it make humans anxious that there would be a replica of themselves? And which particular aspects of ourselves, if taken away or if, copied, would make us most anxious? I suppose, in that scene, he's thinking, what would it take, or what would be the most convincing aspect? I mean, intelligence is just one, it could be something else. I mean, this is about AI, but it's,
Well, to come back to my example of kicking the car, years ago there was a program called Eliza. Eliza was a sort of, like a psychoanalyst. And you would enter into conversation with Eliza and say things like, I'm really unhappy. And Eliza would say, tell me why. And then you'd say, well, my mother beat me every day when I was a child. And Eliza would say, how do you feel? And then you'd be off and running. And Eliza could only say about 30 things. She could say, and how do you feel about that? And similar kinds of remarks. And people reported that they'd had, or some people reported, that they had some of the profoundest conversations in their lives. So we might be nowhere near an Adam, but we will actually find ourselves being disconcerted and fooled and worried in just that way you imagine. If you go on the internet, type robot, you'll find there's a substance now called frubber, of which they make faces out of. And often you are looking at a kind of robot. They're always sitting down. They're plugged into the mains, because one of the great problems we don't even have a battery really to run these things. But there's a newsreader now in Japan that you can look at. There are various others. They haven't quite got the reality of human head movements. So you can see them going like this.
Well, you described this very well. That's what makes him real. Yeah.
It just doesn't quite have the human warmth of. We're very used to watching someone's head move. You cannot speak to someone without moving your head. It's very, very hard to replicate a convincing head movement. I mean, all of these robots. So it's just like the business of not being able to catch a ball, and just how difficult that is. Even a little thing like making a replica of human head movements is slightly beyond us.
But these are all sort of mechanical, I suppose, semi-mechanical tricks.
Whereas, so we can't even do that.
Yeah. Whereas these questions, these more abstract questions, I mean, one of the questions you raise is, the question of free will. So, or fate being factory settings, right? So, and also you can program. I mean, one of the key moments at the beginning, which is sort of often running sort of throughout the book, is that the narrator has this brilliant idea that he will somehow begin a life with his neighbour by sharing the programming of Adam, and so he will do part of it, and then he won't even look at what she's putting into his character. So it would be like a child, genetically that it's related. But then Adam turns around and says, "I was literally." He says, "I was made to love her," and that is, I mean, in a way, I suppose what you were saying just now about Eliza, it's partly, I suppose, the way psychoanalysis works. I mean, it's you discovering things about yourself, but it's also people fooling themselves, right? And so, I was made to love her is the kind of thing people say all the, I was fated. And I mean, what are you doing there? Are you sort of, Are you mocking that idea? Are you exploring? Do you believe in free will? I mean,
I don't believe in free will. I didn't choose my childhood or my genes. And I can choose anything I like, as Schopenhauer famously said, but I can't choose what I like. That's one of those great riddles. I've never seen a convincing argument for free will, and yet it is a completely necessary illusion. I mean, we can't run a criminal justice system unless we take responsibility or expect others to take responsibility for their acts. The only way, I mean, do we want to talk about free will? I mean, the only way around this, I think, is if you own a consciousness, you have to be responsible for what it does. That's, I think, is the, so you've got what Larkin called in The Old Fools, that million-petaled flower of being. You're lucky, you've got yourself born and you have a consciousness. You're just going to have to look after it and try not to murder anyone. But if your body and consciousness murder someone, you're going to have to take the rap. That's even without free will.
Regardless of whether you had free will. So this is one of the things that's raised. I suppose the question of whether a machine can have consciousness is central, right? But then you turn it into conscience, in a way.
Well, when Adam says, yes, of course I feel pain, or of course I'm in love, are we just listening to an elaborate algorithm, or could we ever believe that a machine could have a consciousness? If you're an old-fashioned materialist like me, everything in the mind is based on the brain. So if the brain is a material object, even if it's the most extraordinarily complex thing, it would be at least imaginable that we could make one. In that case, we would have to ascribe consciousness. I once wrote a short story that really ran over 300 or 400 years of how machines like Adam got better and better and better, and more convincing, till you reach a point of sort of, at first it was mocked as political correctness, that it was very rude. At dinner, you're at the Booker launch, say, the Booker dinner, and you say to the very successful publisher sitting across from you, are you real? That's a physically intrusive, horrible thing to say. It's like saying loudly to someone, I hear you've had a colostomy. I mean, in other words, it's so intrusive, you wouldn't dream of saying it. And so it starts with a man who's fallen in love with a beautiful woman, and while they're making love, he says, listen, I know I shouldn't ask this. I know it's terrible. You have to forgive me. But are you real? And the rest of the story is really her answer. I mean, it's just the background to her answer. That is so far ahead of us that, I mean, it's like you and me talking about the afterlife. I mean, we won't be here to witness this, but we can talk about it longingly. And in a sense, we've watched so many movies, read so much science fiction, and we've had so much conversation about artificial consciousnesses. It's almost as if when they come, they'll be rather boring. Of course, we've got used to all that. We've watched Humans and Westworld, and etc.
You say longingly. Is it? I mean, what's the nature of your longing for that particular imaginable, not yet here era?
Well, if you were with someone and it turns out they were made in the Ruhr, would you ever be able to escape what some theorists call the uncanny valley? That it's creepy that someone seems completely real, lovable, funny, intelligent, charming, considerate, kind, everything you'd want in a good friend, but they were made in Solingen, in the Ruhr. Would you ever be able to climb out of that unhappy valley and accept them fully as a human? So the next stage is, should we grant them rights? I mean, I've done jury service a couple of times. I've been astounded by the lack of attention of my fellow jurors and their short memories. And actually, I would think, if I had to sit and be judged by 12 robots, good and true, I might expect a juster outcome.
Well, this
but
is what I mean.
Could we cross that line?
No,
I
but
just
so
don't know.
Why would it be? Yeah.
Why should it be so weird? And yet it is. I mean, it is very, very strange. To contemplate a close relationship with an artificial being, even though we have this capacity to want to do it, to want to relate to the humming fridge that drives you nuts, that you sort of blame it for, or the car that doesn't work, or Eliza. We seem to have this capacity, anthropomorphic capacity.
Yeah. Anthropomorphizing, right? I mean...
Do we say thank you? I mean, it's an old conversation now, because I think we've settled it. We don't. But we don't say thank you to Siri for letting us, to tell us when he's going to wake us up, or how long to boil the egg.
Do you not?
No. Should you tell your children to say thank you to Siri?
Should you thank your children for anything? Never.
Does it encourage bad attitudes to children to speak roughly, as you might, as in the past, a slave, and say, tell me when, or give me the information on, without saying please or thank you? I think the conversation's over for that. We've got our toe in the ocean of this future. Nobody says please or thank you to Alexa or Siri. Or do you? Gabby, come on, fess up.
I occasionally say thanks, yeah, but I mean, I talk to my cats, so you probably can't judge.
But cats have a consciousness.
Yeah, but still crazy cat lady behaviour. I don't think we should take myself as an example. But
no, you can fess up. You talk to a cat.
No, but you're saying children...
It's impossible to live with a dog, for example, and not talk to it. It's absolutely impossible. You know it has a consciousness. It's very happy to see you. It's sulky when you tell it off. I'm talking of our dog. If our dog is reprimanded, he's incredibly unhappy for quite a while. So there's someone in there, there's a consciousness, and I think we're okay now with, I think it's one of the advances of civilization that we now are much gentler with animals than probably people living in this house 400 years ago would have been. The circles of compassion, we mustn't get too pessimistic about the times we live in. Certain things have got better. And we'd find it hard to beat a donkey with a stick.
Yeah, well, that's good. So you're talking about...
You think the bar is very low.
Yeah,
okay.
You're talking about compassion and justice. I mean, you just said perhaps robots would make come up with a juster result. I mean, is there a way in which it could be better to have robots presiding over certain areas of life? Or could they teach us to be better humans in some way?
Well, it's a very interesting question, because all the warnings are about how destructive they might be. And the Mary Shelley book is really powerful. I think it shaped the conversation. But what if we sat round before programming an artificial human? We know how to be good. We have all of our religion. We have all of our philosophies. We have our sort of social instincts of what is a good way to behave to others. And we gave all that to robots. It could be almost more worrying that they were nicer than us.
Right, this is what I mean. Yeah. That would make you more anxious, because
we
that's
would be
the
very
bit.
Anxious.
Yeah.
And then we'd get even more anxious if they were more useful than us. And then, of course, the critical point is when they start designing the next generation, and we no longer understand them fully. That's the point which many people have been talking about lately, who are very, very worried that we could become irrelevant. The professor of future studies at Oxford posed the following rather scary possibility. He said, sooner or later we'll have quantum computing. You will have vast amounts of computing within a very, very small space, atomic level, so all designed around the spin of an atom, giving you your either or, your on-off, as it were. Why do we think robots need to be 5'6" or 6 foot? An optimum size, he suggested, was about 3 millimeters for a quantum-based thinking entity. Live much more lightly on the Earth, consume far less energy, all connected up to each other. So you could come back here to Cliff in 10,000 years, and you'd see, where is everyone? And then you would look down and see, if you could see 3 millimeters, I guess you can, but we will never know. I mean, this is all just
What would they be
fantasy.
up to? Well, that's
Well,
quite a
what
good
they'd be up
segue
to?
into the next
Well,
book.
they'd be having conversations like this. I mean, literary festivals and
Better than this. Sure.
playing the
You know,
violin.
their brains would be...
No, but I mean, our size is completely arbitrary. Well, it's all to do with efficiency, gravity, but we share the planet with lots of other creatures that are very tiny, and some of them are bigger than us. We live in that middle world, roughly. But a really intelligent being with quantum computing could be, it doesn't need to be our size.
That's interesting.
So sometimes I find myself completely entranced by these speculations, and I have to remind myself that I've only got about 20 years max left, and it just doesn't matter.
Hang on, think about, if you... the small things may lead us onto the cockroach, but just before we get there, a couple of things. I'm slightly thinking aloud about what you said about Turing. It hadn't struck me that it was that you formulated it as having been saved from a certain injustice, essentially, in this book. I mean, I sort of understood that he was still alive, he hadn't killed himself, but I hadn't equated those things. And then there's this other question of Hiroshima, the bomb not having been dropped on Hiroshima in this book. So some of the counterfactual elements are to do with a danger that's present but hasn't somehow reached its final outcome. And I wonder if those things are related. So in other words, I wonder if the decision not to drop the bomb is related to the progress in artificial intelligence in your formulation.
Well, I'm very interested in the idea that where we are with science and technology could have been completely otherwise. I mean, we might not have had an industrial revolution in the 18th century in the north of England. Could have been somewhere else. We could have gone at a different speed, faster, slower. So that's also true politically. I mean, how easy it would have been for us to have had a very different outcome in the Falklands War. So that's something I want to touch on. So had the two Israeli software weaponizing guys managed to get the Argentinians to properly prime their Exocet missiles. Had MI6 not gone around the world buying up all the spare Exocet missiles, posing as arms dealers, it was a very precarious thing. You send a fleet 8,000 or 10,000 miles into the South Atlantic, they could have been so easily picked off. So what are the consequences politically for Britain, for Mrs. Thatcher, who was so identified with this matter, and what would be the consequences for the Argentinians? At the time, back in '82, I had only one close friend who was for the Falklands War, but yet everyone, I mean, all the polls were showing 85% for. So it was the same bubble that we might live in Brexit. I've heard people say, I've got no Brexit friends. Everyone I know is against it. They live in a bubble, and I lived in this bubble with the Falklands War. I had only one friend, and he always loved a good war, and that was Christopher Hitchens. And he said of the Falklands War, you've got to see it as an anti-fascist war. Forget, the local stuff with Mrs. Thatcher and all the flag waving. The Galtieri regime was one of the most vicious, fascistic juntas. So he would say, if we lost the Falklands War, Argentina would not have become a democracy. I think I have to give him points on that. Mm-hmm. What would be the political future for Mrs. Thatcher? Well, you might think, well, that would be the end of her career. But actually, in my version, because so much of the country has been for this, and 3,000 have died, she comes out of Downing Street and makes her famous "I take it on my shoulders" speech, which actually goes down extremely well. And she lasts right up to the next election. She lasts another 4 years. And in that same year, I remember being at the Labour Party conference when it was a fierce fight for who would be deputy leader between Tony Benn and Dennis Healey. What if Tony Benn had become deputy leader and then in the next election, prime minister? And then what if Tony Benn was asleep in the bed that Mrs. Thatcher was in the Grand Hotel in Brighton when the IRA bombed it? And now, if that bomb had just been 18 inches to the right, it would have killed whoever was in that room. So Tony Benn, who's already taking us out of Europe, remember that he, without a referendum, is killed, and then Dennis Healey becomes Prime Minister, and he takes us back into Europe. All I'm saying is that the present is the frailest possible construct. It could be so easily something else. It seems so locked in that we can't quite imagine it being other. So the technology gives rise to Adam. It's impossible, but this is the nature of fiction. You can live with the possible, with the impossible. So the frail, impossible construct of politics, of literature, it's a game we can all play, and there are many counterfactual novels. But in a way, all novels are based on this sort of as if. Anyway, it's not just about, it's not just science fiction that does this.
But they're parallel. I thought they might be contingent on each other. Somehow the progress was related to the political.
Absolutely, that's how you got an Adam.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of which,
yeah,
the cockroach,
yeah,
also counterfactual, or possibly not. I mean, so just to explain the hero, call him a hero, anti-hero of, can I say that? Yeah. Sure. This is sort of an inversion of Kafka's story, where in Kafka there's a man who wakes up as a cockroach, and here there's a cockroach who wakes up as the Prime Minister. And don't jump to any conclusions, because he has got brown hair, right?
Yep. Check. Yep.
Looks completely different to the current Prime Minister, and he becomes Prime Minister immediately after a referendum, when the Prime Minister who had suggested this has resigned, and so chronologically speaking, he's, I suppose, Theresa May, in some way, or related, right?
He's come to put fire in the belly of a dithering Prime Minister who can't get anything done. This is not a roman à clef.
Ben, can we just talk about the rhetoric? Because the rhetoric is a bit of a giveaway.
Yes, okay. So first of all, let me say where I come from on this. I'm a passionate Remainer, I'm afraid. I think we're in a terrible condition with this Vote Leave cabinet. Since I finished this novel, it's actually got worse. So the cockroach nature of these politics, especially the moment of, I call it the humbug moment, when a Labour MP said that she was getting phone calls, threatening emails from people who were actually quoting the Prime Minister.
This past week.
And this was dismissed as humbug by the Prime Minister. I thought, this is really going off the map. Politically, I've never been a member of a party. My politics, my moral line, my political line runs quite boringly, say, between Keir Starmer to Dominic Grieve. Okay, that's where I'm coming from. Maybe with a diversion to Lady Hale, who brought a tear to my eye with her speech. I thought she was speaking the prose of the Putney debates. I felt that we were in the late 17th century, really. I thought it was a magnificent moment. I quite like Keir Starmer's take on social justice. I admire profoundly Dominic Grieve's constitutionalism. Mm-hmm. So that's my, I'm not, I'm not a Corbynite or there's my position. I got to such a point of addiction to the process. I can't stop reading about it. I must have read 3 or 4 million words on this.
Since when? When did the obsession begin?
About 3 years ago, I suppose.
Approximately.
Yeah, how long has this been going on? Do you know that song? So I'm a sucker for it. I used to be doing Trump and Brexit. I come off the Trump.
Right, okay.
Methadone.
Alter your meds, yeah.
So I read that I'm sort of following the impeachment proceedings, but not with the same sick fascination that I have with this process. So there's a certain amount of despair, I feel, and out of that despair came a sort of, not only anger, but a wish for comedy. So I'd very much like to read a Brexit comedy about Remainers. I just don't think in political satire you want to be balanced. I'm not a TV presenter. I'm coming from a position in which I think this is not right. This is very sad. The discussion has become very, very crude. So 25 cockroaches make their way from the Palace of Westminster, where they live, and they go and inhabit the minds and bodies of various ministers and critically the Prime Minister. And they've come to sort of push do I need to be telling you this novel that you might never read? But anyway.
Yes, they will read it today.
No. I haven't touched Brexit. I've got a parallel process called reversalism.
What do you mean you haven't touched Brexit? It is.
I was looking for something as self-evidently daft and self-harming as Brexit, and I'm not sure I succeeded, but I'll give you reversalism. Reversalism is about reversing the money flow. So you, at the end of the working week, you hand over, money for your job. Where do you get this money? You go shopping. When you buy goods, you get your retail price of everything you take away from the shop, and with that money, you can afford your job. It's all perfectly logical. It works incredibly well. If you're caught speeding, and of course the police have slightly more powers now, the police will hand you £100 through the window, which means you're going to have to work overtime because you're not allowed to hoard money. So you've got to keep going. You've got to keep things flowing. The great difficulty comes when you trade with other nations. Will the Germans, when they send us a BMW, also send us the 50,000 euros? We're quite happy, I guess, to be sending money away, but we don't, there's an imbalance, a trade imbalance, so it's expensive. So you get to the point of reversalism in one country. That's where we're at in the cockroach. Reversalism in one country, as you know from your studies of Lenin, is that the rest of the world will slowly see the absolute correctness of the way you have taken. So I never thought I'd be writing a cabinet meeting. I've never been in one. I just have to imagine how it might be. And when the Prime Minister, now a cockroach, but in human form, he actually watches, by the way, a cockroach leave Downing Street to go and take his place in the Palace of Westminster. When he sits down at the cabinet table and everyone's calling him Jim Sams is his name, he realizes that all the other cabinet ministers were also, he thought he was on a lonely mission. He's very relieved to see that actually, anyway, the process is hugely successful.
Reversalism, yeah. And he persuades the American president.
Well, he's called Archie Tupper, a name borrowed from Annalena, my wife's novel. We thought a bit of sort of cross-textualism was in order. And I couldn't think of a good name, and she already had. So, yes, the American president is coming around to this. But one point, though,
American president's tweets, not based on anything we know in real life.
Well, Jim sees the point of social media and tweeting, and his first attempts are incredibly clumsy. Then he takes a masterclass by reading Tupper's tweets, and he sees how beautifully compressed they are, how they have these little hanging verbs, how exaggerated they are, but with a sort of poetry.
Yes.
And then
The capital letters?
right at the end, sad. No,
Right.
bad.
Bad.
No, bad.
Bad.
Yeah, bad. 3 exclamation marks. And he sees how to do it. And actually, while I was writing that, I was thinking, actually, they're pretty good. We've got used to them, but, try writing one yourself. Dull conversation at Clifton, bad. So, it's a very silly novella, I'm afraid.
Hang
on. Brexiters will hate it. Some Remainers. Oh, yeah, I heard that one Remainer said, I've been a Remainer all my life, but I've just read this novel. I think I can become a Brexiter. And I thought,
Okay.
that's fine. I'm working for both camps now.
Yeah, well, that makes you very even-handed. I mean, you said
Yeah.
satire couldn't be, but perhaps it can be, inadvertently.
Yeah.
So at the end, if we can say this, that there is a cabinet meeting held entirely in pheromone as a language.
Yeah. Right at the end, they all go back into their cockroach bodies, and they've arranged to meet in the cabinet room. But the legs of the table are very highly polished, and it's quite high up. So they meet behind a waste paper basket. And the Prime Minister gives a very, very, what I'd like to think it was anyway, a very stirring speech, saying that really ordinary, decent people might well be very, very sad when reversalism comes around, because there'll be bumps in the road. It's going to be tough. They'll probably be poorer. But they'll have a certain kind of reversalism sovereignty. And that given that the happiness in the universe is a constant, they'll be consoled to know that where there's poverty, war, dissent, civilizational breakdown, cockroaches flourish. And cockroaches will be happier. And then he says, it's time to go. Remember to turn left as you go out the door of Downing Street. And they march back to Westminster. It takes several hours when you're a cockroach.
He instructs the policeman on the door to leave the front door ajar.
Ajar,
So they can get,
yeah, so they all go out. And then there's a terrible accident just at the end when the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster runs out into the road too soon and is, goes under a dustbin lorry. But otherwise, I mean, it's not a roman clip.
No, not at all, no.
It's a sort of parallel universe, and it won't please everyone.
But not at all a remarkable. But as you say, the sequel's sort of writing itself just this week.
I'm interested in next week. Can Swinson be turned? This is a very interesting question.
Could you give us the first chapter to next week's instalment of The Cockroach?
Well, either the whole reversalism project is about to fail, or it's going to succeed but not till January, or it's going to succeed at the end of October.
Yeah, we know that.
No.
Give us more.
Well, we're not going to revoke. I'm against that. In those sort of fantasies of dictatorship, if I were king.
Yes.
But I think that's politically unacceptable.
Wait, if you were king, what?
I'd press revoke, yeah. But since I live in a parliamentary democracy, I would hope for a second vote. If in that vote people still want to leave, that would be my moment when I say, okay, I fully accept. I will not be rioting. I couldn't have told you, Gabby, the difference between the single market and the customs union 3 or 4 years ago. Now I can, and I think a lot of us have learned quite a lot.
Yes, we've all become...
Not only about the EU, but about the own state of our democracy. And it has been a giant mirror that's been held up to us. It reminds me a bit of in 1940 when there were lots of evacuees going out into the country, and suddenly one half of the country realized there were kids that were so feral, so hungry, so ill-kempt, so ill-looked after, and they were staying, in the vicarage. I mean, Evelyn Waugh is described as princess. And the House of Commons had a debate about it. It was as if, in that moment, in phony war months, that the country had suddenly seen itself. So I think both Remainers and Brexiters now have an angle on themselves they never had before. And we have to accept that right in the middle of austerity, people were never going to push the button for the status quo. Never. Why would they? And then, well, there's much else to say about this, but I think it has been, for all the sorrow and all the pain and all the despair, quite illuminating as to who we are, what we are, and then leave or stay, what we must do about it, about ourselves, I think.
Well, what to do with it? What would be an improvement, leave or stay?
Well, I think it comes down to social justice and distribution of wealth, finally. We're a very unequal society. And people are very cross about that. I think it's unfortunate that they're blaming the EU. It's not the EU that said, could you kindly distribute most of the money to a 1%, or could you kindly, or we order you, to have the Southeast so much more prosperous. And much else. I mean, it wasn't the EU that said, will you please take 1.3 million Poles in a year? The EU had a perfectly reasonable rule, possibility that you could wait 7 years for the economies of Poland and all the other accession countries to come up. And when people complained that the schools were overcrowded suddenly and waiting rooms in doctors were full, I think the richer South dismissed them as xenophobes. But they actually had a very good point. So we've been on a journey of discovery, and it's not over, obviously, yet.
About ourselves and each other.
But live with the EU or turn away from it. We're going to have to do something about ourselves. I think that's what I mean.
Well, just before we ask you to ask some questions, Boris, who's not in either of these books, man or machine?
Well, if we're talking metamorphosis, because this is entirely, takes off from Kafka, how did an expensively educated, completely charming and very funny fellow, I've spent a little time with him, and we had 75 minutes, just the two of us, on Shakespeare, and we had a really good time. How did such a figure become a boneheaded populist? That's the question that only Kafka could answer.
Or Mary Shelley.
Well, no, I mean, he's all too human, I think.
I see. Okay, well, that's one answer. Yeah. You're allowed to ask some questions if you'd like. Do you want to put your hands up if you have a question, and a mic will be brought to you by one of these very helpful people who are holding them? No? We can carry on talking if you don't have any questions, but I imagine you do, and you're just a bit afraid to put your... Ah, there you go. Okay. Thank you.
Just going back to the machines and artificial intelligence, and expanding a bit more on the rights of machines vis-a-vis, let's say, the rights of animals.
Yes.
What legal rights do you think we could put in place or should put in place
For machines?
for
Well,
machines?
well, right now, probably none, but at the point at which we... So there's, the old Turing test, which is, if there's a voice behind the screen and you can't tell whether it's human or a machine, you might as well treat it as a human. And if we cannot tell the difference between an artificial human and a human, I think then you'd have to give it all the rights that humans have. That would be my probably very oversimplified response, but yeah. But that is so far ahead. We just have to consider the human brain. Roughly 100 billion neurons, roughly on average 7,000 connections per neuron, all in a liter, liquid cooled, running on 25 watts. like one of those light bulbs. We would have to have machinery more or less to fill this whole tent, and it would require terabytes of sort of cooling fluid. And we're so far removed of having the processing power that we have. But meanwhile, of course, machines can remember things and sift vast amounts of data and draw conclusions from them. But to run a visual cortex like ours, to run human relations and read or even write novels, is far and far away from us. But that point, I think, would come if we thought they had a consciousness. We would have to, not only that, we'd have to ask them, if they have rights, they'd also have responsibilities, as, who was it, Tony Blair or whoever used to say? Bill Clinton, I can't remember.
Tony Blair or Schopenhauer, yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, somebody, do you already have a mic? Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Ian, thank you very much for that. Really enjoyed listening to you. Can you tell me which of your books do you consider to be your best, and what are you working on next?
Which is my best?
Yeah.
I used to dodge that question by saying, just like my children or something. But actually, some children are nicer than others. So I now speak up for my least read novel called Black Dogs, published in the early 90s. And I happened to open it a couple of months ago. I thought, yeah, I was quite good in my 40s. Not sure I measure up in my 70s. So yeah, Black Dogs.
Great.
Probably out of print. I don't know.
It's not out
No,
of
it's not.
print.
No, it's not out of print.
We have another question. Yes. Sorry, hang on.
Thank you. Assuming that your robots do acquire the capacity, the intelligence to produce real works of art, do you think they would ever have the qualities to produce great ones? I mean, I remember that Adam is a prolific writer of Japanese short verse in the novel.
Haiku.
Haiku,
Really
yeah.
say much about the quality of that verse. There are hints here and there, but
I did my best with his haikus.
will these robots ever be able to produce great works of art, do you think?
Well, if we're predicating this on an artificial human that has everything a human has, then if the occasional human can write a great novel, then we'd have to accept that they can too. Again, it just seems so remote because, and anyway, why would it want to write novels that humans would be interested in? It would probably want to write novels that other artificial humans would care about.
Because I was about to judge.
Would you want them on the Booker Prize judging panel?
Well, the panel would have to have all robots to judge the
well,
robot books.
we let in the Americans. So, So, again, even in answering the question, I sort of sense, and it's actually the question to ask, I think, it's so remote from us. There comes a moment in Machines Like Me when a 4-year-old child comes into this novel, and in parenthesis, I say that one of the reasons I had a 4-year-old child is because I read a review of a book by a man who spent his life taking LSD, and he said, if you want to know what it's like to take LSD, have breakfast with a 4-year-old.
Is that right?
So, you know what I mean. Anyway, there's probably no greater learning device on the planet than a 4-year-old human. Accumulating language roughly at 15 words a day, every day astounding or horrifying their parents was something that you thought they shouldn't or couldn't possibly know, and so on. And looking out at the back of the main house here, I was observing that huge lawn. Every child that got into that lawn started running for the pure joy of it. So Adam, he's got quite a lot of moderate hostility to this 4-year-old. he cannot quite see why it would want to do something like dance, because what's the purpose of that? And he also knows that he's in the presence of a learning machine that's far more effective than he is. I don't know how I got from great novels to that, but all I mean is, what a long way even for Adam to travel yet to understand the point of art, or the pointlessness of art, rather, the pointlessness of dance, the sheer joy of moving or running into an empty space.
Yeah, he's an important character, Mark, actually. Did you have a question?
You've emphasized, obviously, rightly, the immense distance between this fantasy and where we are. But there must be a kind of, as I was hearing you, a kind of counter, quasi-secret counter notion, which is that we as a species, but you as a member of the species, have quite notably have been creating the illusion of life quite impressively. And I began to get curious as to what kind of machine you think your characters are. What's the status of what you do so magically and professionally? I mean, which is to produce this astonishing, as you not alone, but your tribe produces this astonishing effect of artificial life.
Well,
in this.
If we take I take it as my starting point is that the mind is what the brain does, and the brain is a material thing, sort of liquidy, porridgey thing, and we all have one, and we're so used to it that the miracle of it only rarely crosses our mind, of what it's like to possess a mind. That if we make the assumption that we could replicate that somehow in a machine, we would have to buy into the idea that they too could make life in their imaginations. They too could do all the things that we could do. It's just that the process might run away from us. In other words, that crucial moment when the next generation of artificial humans has been designed by artificial humans, and the minds therefore might not be like our minds, and we would diverge. What need then of us? That's the question that's being asked all over the AI community. If they were nicer than us, more efficient than us, kinder, more morally consistent, because we haven't really talked about this, but the central moment of this novel is a moral question about a woman who takes her revenge, but quite understandable revenge. And to do so, she has to lie to the police and to the courts. Should she go to jail? Because what she done, most people would perfectly understand why she did what she did. The narrator and Miranda, the one who tells these whoppers in the court, take one view, but Adam takes a very different other view, because he has none of the cognitive defects that humans so clearly have, that we constantly cut slack for our friends on certain principles. So we might all agree that it's wrong to lie to the court, or also think it's a wonderful thing, the rule of law, except when it's me or the one I love. I have at the front a quotation from Kipling about how machines cannot lie. Lying is a really important oil of human relationships. And I take the two examples. One is, you go to see a dying friend, and you find yourself saying, but you're looking a lot better today. Or the more trivial example would be, someone you love dearly has been to the hairdresser, and it's a total disaster. And you say, no, it's fine. It looks fine. You have to be a long way down robot development and algorithm development to be able to write white lies. Because to write a white lie in code, you're going to have to understand the mind of someone else and what it's like to be them. And also the randomness, the possibility that we could apply it in so many different situations. How could you write the code for that? Maybe machine learning could defeat that. But I come back to this point that if we take a materialist view of the brain, the mind is a product of the brain, then we would have to maybe rather gloomily accept that they can be Tolstoy and Flaubert.
But I think maybe another interpretation of your question was that it's already been done, right? That this is a question about authorship and that you yourself were already producing, perhaps more disembodied than Adam, but, you know, you, right?
Well,
I mean, it is partly about authorship, and you as an author have been doing this for years and years, producing.
Yeah, but making life, imagined life, I think is a very interesting thing.
You're imagining all the time. Now, I'm told we've run out of time. Are we allowed to run on a bit? Because there are still some questions. A little bit, because I know you had your hand up. And yes, can we do that?
I'm just wondering how it's possible to program artificial intelligence with compromise, with the concept of compromise, which goes back to your point about flaws, because they're supposed to be perfect.
Well, again, compromise is one of those sort of human matters, which is, in order to do it, you've got to understand that someone has another point of view from your own and understand what it would be like to be that person. So again, it's rather like the instance of the white lie. And again, at this stage of our technology, we are nowhere near any possibility of that. And we're not proving very good at it ourselves at the moment. So.
But it does tell us something about being human, which is also your point about Brexit. You know, each of these things teaches us.
It's either we come out of this politically mature, or we'll have a civil war. So take your choice.
50-50. Well, thank you all very much for coming. I'm afraid, I'm going to have to wrap it up. But thanks to Ian, most of all, for entertaining us.